Welcome to Brent Fixed It. Today I'm going to show how I made a Lego bunk bed. I used Shaper 3D to come up with the design of the bed. This part was critical. There are a lot of areas when making this project where you can screw up the dimensions or the orientation of the part if you don't follow the plans closely. I started out working around a twin extra large mattress for the top bunk and a queen mattress on its own frame for the bottom bunk. I already had these mattresses, so that is why I went with an unusual mattress combination for a bunk bed. But this design can be easily modified to accommodate a variety of mattress sizes and incorporating a frame for both mattresses. I will have plans available soon and will put a link to them in the description below. The bed was constructed from ordinary framing lumber that you can get anywhere. I recommend purchasing the straightest lumber you can find and then let them sit for a couple weeks at least to let them dry out before starting. I cut everything to rough length to make the next steps easier. I cut everything about an inch longer than the final length to give me some wiggle room to get the exact length once the boards are squared up a little better. I don't have a jointer or planer, which would have made the rest of the milling easier. I started out just taking a little off the edge of the 2x4s to remove the factory rounded edge. After running all the pieces through, I flipped the pieces over, moved my fence in slightly, placed the freshly cut edge against the fence, and ran everything through again. This isn't as good as a jointer, but it does help take out some of the bow in the construction lumber. I flipped the boards over again and made my final cut at 3-inch width for the 2x4s and 6-inch width for the 2x8s. For the longer pieces, like the legs, I cut 2 at a time so they would be even. I cut a little off one end to square the parts off. Mark my final measurement of 78 inches in this case, then flip them over. Clamp them together. And made the final length cut. After all the parts were cut to length, I moved on to drilling pocket screws. I drilled 4 pocket screws on each end of the pieces that will be the head and foot of the bed frame. The pieces that make up the railing will get 2 pocket screws per end as well. I next moved on to using wood filler to fix some gouges in the frame pieces, as well as fill in some knot holes. After the filler dried, I sanded it all smooth. On the side pieces of the bed frame, I ran a bead of glue, then clamped and screwed the piece that will hold the mattress. It helps to have a lot of clamps, even though I'm using screws as well. I had to do a good amount of bending to get it to sit flush all the way down. I pre-drilled the screws to avoid splitting this fairly thin piece of wood. After the glue dried, I took the clamps off and sanded some more. Next comes the fun part, cutting all 284 2-inch pieces from dowels. I took a scrap piece of 2x4 and clamped it to my fence to act as a stop block so I could get consistent lengths, but also give enough room for the piece to fall away from the blade without getting wedged between the fence and the blade and getting shot back at you. Even with the stop block, don't stand directly behind the piece you're cutting. I still had a few random pieces fall into the blade and shoot back at me. Looking back, I should have attached a scrap piece of wood to my miter gauge as well. That would have given a backing to the cut piece and helped push it past the blade. After you get all of the Lego pieces cut, you now have 284 pieces to sand. A sanding station would be helpful here. I don't have one, so I just held my random orbital sander in one hand and the piece in the other. If you hold it in the center between two fingers, it's pretty easy to spin it to get all of the splinters off from cutting. I made a jig to line up the pieces out of a board cut to 3 inches wide by 6 inches long. I used a 2-inch hole saw to cut 2 holes spaced 3 inches apart. I made 2 of these. I would place my jig against the edge of the piece, the footboard in this case, spread some glue in the holes, place the pieces in the hole, and then drive a couple of brad nails to hold them in place. I then placed my second jig up against the first one and repeated the process. There's a little bit of wiggle room in the jig, so I used a framing square to keep the jig at a right angle. I would work my way down from one end for a few rows and then start at the other end. I figured if my spacing got off slightly, it wouldn't be as noticeable in the middle. On the side rail of the bed frame, you have to attach 3 spacer boards to attach the railing later. Be sure to keep track of where they go so you don't accidentally put a Lego piece there. I just glued and clamped the spacer pieces in. I will be running screws through them later and didn't want to have them run into screws or nails at this step. I put some wood filler in each of the nail holes, but I don't think this step was really necessary. I didn't fill every nail hole, and once it was painted, the nail holes weren't that noticeable. For the legs on the 1.5 by 1.5 piece, I made a mark every 6 inches for the pocket holes. I then transferred those marks to the other 3 pieces and then drilled the pocket holes. I then glue and screwed it onto the larger piece. I didn't film this, but I then laid out where the bed frame would go and then glued in the other filler pieces. To fill the pocket holes, I just put a little glue in the hole and tapped a dowel in and cut it flush. I didn't get all the pieces flush with each other. I first tried a random orbital sander, but then switched to a belt sander and a block plane to flush up the pieces in a few spots. If I had to do it over, I wouldn't build the legs like this. I would have glued and clamped 2 2x4s together, then ran them through the table saw like I showed earlier to get the 3x3 dimension. I would then use a router and chisel to cut out the notch for the bed frame. Once the legs were all together and sanded, I used an 1/8 inch roundover bit to take just a little off all the corners so they weren't sharp. I then glued and nailed the Lego pieces onto the legs using my jig as I did earlier with the bed frame. The rails got the same treatment. I had a bow in some of my railings, so I used a clamp to straighten it out on my workbench so the spacing would be right. Also, be sure to leave out a Lego piece at the correct spots to make room for the vertical rails. The last parts to make are the slats for the mattress to sit on. To speed up the process, I put a dado stack at a 3/4 inch depth in my table saw to take off the material on each end. That will do it for this video. In part 2, I will finish up the bed by assembling all the pieces and show you how I made the stairs. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more projects coming up, both large and small. And thank you for watching.